that generally, sadly, African writers aren't getting access to the market in the same way as some other nationalities, and we'd like to, some other continents, and we'd like to try and do something about that. Cool.
Awesome. So I think we'll jump right in.
Yeah. So basically, what is fiction? It's a make-believe world. It's a world that we create for ourselves, for entertainment, or for teaching, or for information. And it's a world that the author dreams up and puts down on paper for people to read. It's beyond the technical issues of grammar and punctuation and spelling. It's a layered world. It's a world with themes and complexities and characters, and it's a world that will engross a reader. Literacy is a goal, I think, across the globe for young people. Everybody is very aware of the fact that as literacy levels improve, so do children's life chances. And apart from that, I personally believe that reading is a huge amount of fun and entertainment. And so while there is the important educational side, there is also the sheer pleasure side, and that's not to be underestimated. And in fact, I think children engage more with reading when they enjoy what they're reading, rather than when they feel they're getting a lesson. Writers, I think, benefit from working with editors. I think editors can really help writers improve and polish and think about what they're saying in the best and most eloquent way. In a way, that's an editor's job. An editor is a sort of glorified reader, somebody who reads a story and thinks about how it works, where it might need a little bit of clarity and help. And I suppose the fiction editor brings an outsider's eye to a manuscript. And that's what I do for a living. I read and critique and advise. I'm going to start today by looking at voice in books. As I said, I'm going to look at two things today. I'm going to look at voice and character. And what is voice? Voice, I think, is two things. It's the voice of the author. It's your voice. It's the way that you speak. It's the way that you express yourself and the way that you choose to tell your story. But it's also the voice of the book, the way that you choose to tell a story. Is it going to be funny? Is it going to be serious? Is it going to be frightening? And what kind of characters are you creating? And what do they sound like to the reader? And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about characters, because each character should have a different voice, that when one is reading a book, one should have a sense of the different characters and their distinct nature. So voice is...
Just before you go ahead, I just wanted to mention that, you know, at the end of every session, so there are 3 sessions, at the end of every session, we will have practice exercises that we hope will be helpful in getting us to put the new things that we are learning into practice. And at the end of the 3 sessions, we're going to have an open call where you can submit stories that you started working on, you've already worked on and improved from the masterclass. And so we encourage like very active participation in terms of like, if it's helpful to take notes, etc. Again, the chat section is there. So, if there's something interesting that you're learning, anything new, conversation, you can drop that in the chat. And if there are any questions, you can drop them in the Q&A. You might not see other people's questions, but we will see the questions. And at a point in the session, we'll break and then do some questions and answers.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Debbie. So what components go into having a fleshed out voice? Well, there's word choice, the words your narrator and character chooses to express themselves. There's imagery, the images and comparisons you and your characters use to describe things. There's syntax, is how your characters form sentences. Are they long, flowing, short, choppy, interrupted? Are they in slang? Are they in perfect idiom? There's rhythm. how often a character talks or narrates, how long they go on for, the urgency versus the slowness of their thoughts, their descriptions and speech. There's mood. Voice should change with the character or a narrator's mood and what's going on in the scene. In our real lives, we can sometimes be different people when we're feeling happy or sad or angry. And of course, there's simplicity. Simplify. Clunky writing is the enemy of a strong voice. Writers can say something in a complicated, roundabout way, or they can find a simple way of expressing big ideas. And in my experience and to my taste, I think the simpler things are told, the better. But author voice is all about you, and it's just you. It's the way that you think and speak and write. And it isn't just vocabulary, it's your style, it's your gift as a storyteller, it's your ability to plot or use beautiful imagery. It's the way you create character depth. It's like your fingerprint, author voice. Character voice is malleable. A strong voice is what makes a character stand out and what makes a character compelling and what engages a reader and holds their attention. So things to consider when working on your voice. Many authors feel it's easier to create a strong and compelling character voice when they're writing in the first person. And a first person plot does help with that. It is the voice that you're hearing is that character's voice. A third person plot tends to be told through the voice of the author, who's telling us, showing us the voice of various characters. That does allow for more sophistication, does allow for a more balanced storytelling when you have the voice of more characters coming through. So there's ways to give your characters voice. You can have, as I said, they can have dialects, they can speak with an accent, they can have regional accents, they can have tics and stutters, they can think and ponder more or speak quickly. If your character is unsure of herself, she might end each sentence with a question. If a character is confident, they can have lots of declarative statements and commands. A queen bee might be somebody who cuts people off a lot when they're speaking, and that helps really create a sense of voice and character. When you're thinking of voice, think of the rhythm and flow of your words and sentences, and how do they sound when they're read aloud? Do you vary the length of your sentences, and do you listen to the way people speak? Think about how that can be used in your writing. A lot of writers talk about how they sit on the bus or stand in a queue and they overhear conversations and they notice strong elements of people's voices around them, and that can be reflected in their writing. Another thing that's very important in thinking about voice is thinking about the setting and context of your novel. If you're creating a story in which the main protagonist is a child from a very wealthy background who goes to an exclusive private school and is driven around in the car all the time, they're going to see the world quite differently to a child who has to walk to their local school and doesn't have access to the same physical comforts. How do those children filter the world, and then how do they express it? And that's voice, that's their voice. Somebody brought up in a rural environment is going to see the world very differently to somebody that's brought up in the city. And I think that's another way of thinking about how to manage your voice. Think very carefully about the world setting and what would be an authentic voice coming out of that setting. Here's an example of, I'm going to read you a couple of examples of voice, which I think are really interesting. So this is the first. This sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together are monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. Now listen. I vary the sentence length and I create music. Music. The writing sings. It has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences and I use sentences of medium length, and sometimes When I'm certain the reader is rested, I will engage him with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of a crescendo, the roll of the drums, the crash of the cymbals, sounds that say, listen to this, it is important. So the key takeaway from thinking about voice is thinking about the novel, the overall voice that you want to establish in your book, and the voices of your individual characters and how they relate to one another to create pace, energy, enthusiasm, and drive through the story. Something that I think helps throughout the entire course of building a book is reading what you've written aloud, not simply reading it off the page, really listening to your words and how they sound. I think it can be really hard to read our own writing and to assess our own writing, and it can also be really hard to hear our own writing. And I've heard some writers suggest that the best thing to do is to read into a tape recorder, to record yourself, to leave what you've recorded, to go away for a few days and then to come back and listen. And it's when you can listen with a bit of distance on it that you can really hear where things can be improved and how things can be polished and how things can be made better, and how if your characters are beginning to merge into one in terms of how they speak and sound, by hearing yourself read out their dialogue and their interactions, you start to see where you can differentiate them a bit. And I think that is the main thing on voice. Ursula K. Le Guin wrote a wonderful book called Steering the Craft. I'm going to recommend a few books as we go through the workshop that I hope will be helpful to people who want to read more about writing. I think writing is, I believe writing is a craft, and I believe as a craft it can be improved, it can always be improved. You can always think about what you've done and think about making it better, like dressmaking or cooking or driving a car. The more experience you have, the more competent you become. And something that I think is also really helpful and useful is to read books about writing. And there's some wonderful books. And this title, Steering the Craft by Ursula Le Guin, which is a really fantastic book. She's such a wonderful writer, and in a way she's considering her own work when she thinks about this. She says, the sound of the language is where it all begins. The test of a sentence is, does it sound right? The basic elements of language are physical, the noise words make, the sounds and silences that make the rhythms marking their relationship. Both the meaning and the beauty of the writing depend on these sounds and rhythms. This is just as true of prose as it is of poetry, though the sound effects of prose are usually subtle and always irregular. Most children enjoy the sound of language for its own sake. They wallow in repetitions and luscious word sounds and the crunch and slither of onomatopoeia. They fall in love with musical or repetitive words and use them in all the wrong places. Some writers keep this primal interest in and love for the sound of languages. Others outgrow their oral sense of what they're reading or writing. That's a dead loss. An awareness of what your own writing sounds like is an essential skill for a writer. Fortunately, it's quite easy to cultivate, to learn, or to reawaken. A good writer, like a good reader, has a mind's ear. So I would encourage everybody to think really hard about how you hear your own work. And of course, one of the best things to do as a writer is to read. To read widely, read all sorts of different writing. And I think it's very easy for us as readers to think, oh, I don't like this kind of book, or I really like historical fiction, I don't really like crime fiction. But by reading across as wide a range of books as possible, I think you get a much more practiced ear for hearing voice, and that will help you hear your own voice. So I wonder if we should stop for a few minutes and have some questions. If Debbie is let me see. I'm wondering if she's around to give us some questions. I wonder if, 1 second, sorry guys. Yes, we are. You, what's happening? I think we're all still here. I've got a screen that says I've got 52 participants. Can you get back in? Okay. All right. Well, Debbie's being dropped out of the call, so let me try to find the Q&A bit. And I'll see if I can find any questions. So we have a question: what are some common mistakes that you see children's writers make, and how does one consider age of a child to write to? Thank you very much. It's a great question. I'm afraid to say that there are as many mistakes as there are people, because we all make mistakes. And actually what makes that question, that bit of the question, quite hard to answer, I think, is that there's no one correct answer. There's no one thing that's right. I hope I haven't frozen. If you can hear me, I would love somebody to write into the Q&A just to say that I'm still here and talking to you. Great, thank you. So don't worry about common mistakes. There's nothing that either can't be mended or resolved, and there's no, I don't worry so much about mistakes. I think if it's a mistake, it's amendable. Now, how do you consider age for children to write to? There are categories, I think, which is important to bear in mind. If you think that your average child learns to read at around, eloquently read, full literacy around 7, there's an age range from about 7 to 10, and then there's another little bulk of reading between about 10 and 13, and then there's 13 plus. And I think what defines each of those categories is the first one, the 7 to 10, is commonly known as middle grade. And those stories tend to be quite home-based or school-based and domestic. And while they can deal with difficult issues like loss, grief, bullying, they tend to be done in a way that's very gentle and tender. 10 to 12 is sort of young teen, 10 to 13 is considered to be young teen. And those stories often reflect a wider world as the child starts to enter into a more complex set of relationships with the world in general, going to senior school, taking on more complex relationships, things becoming more complex as they start to kind of come up to the top of the hill towards adulthood. And then 13 plus, 13 to 18, the range of stories that can be published in that age category is very, very diverse and very complex, and can range from quite secure, safe stories to some very, very challenging stories about social injustice. Certainly at the moment, one of the things that we're seeing quite a lot turning up in fiction is issues to do with Black Lives Matter, about police brutality, issues to do with the pandemic, social inequality, migration, issues that are very politically focused and challenging. So I think it is very wise to be aware of those three age groups. And then if you're writing a middle grade story, a younger story, you should also be thinking about length. 30,000 words would be very sort of top length for that age group, a child to be reading to itself. The young teen, the sort of 10 to 13, 30 to 50, and then to older teen, it can be anything from 30 to 100,000 words, depending on what you're writing. So extent is a helpful barometer too to bear in mind when thinking about the age of your reader. I hope that's helpful. Do let me know if you need any more information on that. Let me have a look for some other questions. Can a writer use his or her own experience as a piece of writing for children? Yes, I think you can. And I think that's very often how people do write. We're just about to publish this wonderful book at Pushkin Press, where my other job, and it's set in Jamaica, and it's set around one summer where a little girl has lost her memory, and the mystery of the story is what's happened, where has her memory gone? And the author has set it on her distinct memories of one summer she had as a child in Jamaica. Yes, I think when we're close to something, actually, it makes it much easier to write about, rather than to write about something that's completely separate to us and that we don't have a relationship with. So do use your own experiences. It's probably the best way of having ideas for stories, because basically we're all pretty much the same. And if we had an experience as a child at school which was funny or frightening, or something that happened to us as a young person, a loss of a parent, or the joy of a new sibling, those are great things to inspire stories. Somebody's asked if we'll get handouts after each session. I'm not thinking so much of that at the moment, but what I'd said at the beginning of this chat was that if there's things that people want, if you do let us know, we can prepare to make sure that we do give that to you. And what I was thinking of doing at the end of each session is to provide writing exercises. And also, I will give you a reading, my suggestions for books to read that might be helpful in terms of polishing the craft. So I'll definitely be doing that. What does perfect craft mean? Is it in terms of grammar or sentences? I think it means that your book works, that you have written something that's so that as an entity in itself, it works. You can read a book that's perfect grammar and it works, or you can read a book that's perfect grammar and it's just a bit boring. I was talking this morning to my husband about a book called Burma Boy. I don't know if anybody's read that. And it's a book written by a Nigerian author called B. Bandeli. And it's about I'm not sure if it's his father or his grandfather's experience in Burma at the end of the Second World War as one of the, one of the Allied troops. And it's all written in Pidgin English. And it's fantastic. And if it were a case of perfect craft being perfect grammar, that book wouldn't be as wonderful as it is, but it's perfect because he establishes this really powerful voice for his character. And we're completely compelled to read the story of this young man and the extraordinary experience that he had fighting in Burma during the Second World War. How can one create a voice? Somebody said, let's say I grew up in a wealthy home, but I'd like to write from a less privileged perspective. How can I do that? That's very interesting because it's very important to be respectful and true to the way that somebody who hasn't had the privileges of wealth would perceive the world. I think it's about listening and watching and being very aware of the way in which real people relate in the world, and not stereotyping them and their concerns, not assuming that they would be envious of material things or not enjoy their lives because they don't have material things. So I suspect it's probably a really good idea to spend time with people, to look at the way that people live, and to understand as well that basically we're all, I believe, as human beings, we're all quite motivated by the same desires, and that's security, love, care for family, desire for good health for our family and friends. We want shelter. We would feel jealousy in the same way. We'd feel concern and compassion in the same way. And that actually not having shoes to wear, or being concerned about not having food on the table, would impact us, but it wouldn't stop us sharing humanity with people from more affluent walks of life. So it would be a case of just listening carefully and being respectful and looking at the way in which people that we're not so familiar with live, whichever way it is. Somebody's asked about dialogue. Well, we're going to talk about dialogue, but next week. And we're going to try and stay within the voice and character areas today. Let me see if there's any more. So how is a voice considered when basing a book on real historical famed figures, especially when aiming for younger readers aged 7 to 10? That's a great question, thank you. When writing voice in a historical novel, there's sort of two ways to go. There's one that involves a lot of research and a lot of reading around things that were written at that time. The world is full, fortunately, of a lot of references of diaries, letters, books set during certain periods, which give us books written during certain periods, which give us a sense of the voice of people living at that time, and how we would, how we could reflect that in a contemporary novel written now, but set in a historical period, would be to kind of immerse ourselves in the language and the sentiments and understanding of the world of the time by reading diaries, novels, letters. Get into the library. There's so much online, there's so much available to us, and really immerse yourself. So if you're wanting to set your novel in the 1800s in Johannesburg or London or Tokyo, you would go and start to read literature and documents from that time. And then you would work hard to make a voice that would be accessible to a child reading today, because undoubtedly tastes have changed. And I think that some of the literature of 150, 200 years ago is quite heavy going for young people today. The great huge sentences and a sort of flowery use of language, which perhaps is harder, and that we like a more concise and a speedier approach to telling a story, a speedier approach to voice. So you would adapt it. And the other thing I would highly recommend is reading other historical novels that are set at the time that you're interested in writing about, but that are written now. So for example, there's a Ghanaian author called Aisha Haruna Atta, we're publishing this book in October, and it's set in the 1800s, and it's based between Ghana, Nigeria, and Brazil. And Aisha has done a really wonderful job of creating a voice that feels that a contemporary reader would really enjoy it, and at the same time, it does reflect the sentiments and understanding of the universe of people living in the 1800s. So read fiction written now, and read non-fiction, and look at maps and find letters and diaries, and try to build up a sense of the place in your head and in your heart, and that will really help inform how you develop the voice. Somebody said that she gets so, or he gets so caught up in explaining the plot that the character loses their voice. I think that just comes with practice, just with writing and writing. And I also think it's really important to know that if you're committed to writing a novel that you want other people, one day other people to read in its published form, your first draft is literally just a way of kind of clarifying your thoughts. Your second draft is a way of clarifying your thoughts of your first draft, and that you might end up writing 8, 10, 12 drafts of the novel that you're working on. And actually, if you aren't prepared to go through that really, really time-intensive hard work of editing, writing and rewriting, it's possibly going to be quite hard for you to get the really polished thing that you're hoping for. It's hard work writing a novel, and it takes a long time, and it's tough. We've just got to keep going, and so you can polish your voice through those rounds of edits, and the plot can take a back seat, as can your characters. Hi Debbie, you're back. I think you need to turn on your volume, voice thingamajig. So we've been answering some questions. I'm just having a look back through. There's some great questions. Somebody's asked, what's the first group of readers that, I'm sorry, I did actually mean to say this in the introduction, so I will say it again. So there's, in publishing terminology, we talk about middle grade, first readers stroke middle grade. And those are books for children between about 7 and 10. These are very rough age groups, because of course some children are reading incredibly well at 5 and 6, and other children want to carry on reading when they're 11 and 12, those books, but sort of 7 to 10, and that's middle grade. Then there's young teen, which is sort of 10 to 13. And then there's teen YA, which is 13 plus. Somebody's asked, how do we deal with names for characters in children's writing in communities in Africa where names give away ethnicity and stereotypes based on ethnicity is common? How does one avoid fueling this in young minds while naming characters and placing them in controversial settings? Well, that's your job as a writer, particularly if you want to challenge those stereotypes. If you want to suggest that thank you very much for the question, and I'm going to make huge assumptions now, because this would be great in conversation to be able to draw out a little bit more information. But I'm assuming that a certain name would give somebody an idea of somebody's class and social standing, and that the negative connotations of that would be that that person was uneducated, not clever, illiterate, couldn't solve problems. Well, your book could show this person to be the hero who does solve the problems, does resolve the issues, and through doing that, you are tipping the stereotypes on their head, and you're going to be able to encourage young readers to question things that they've taken for granted, or they possibly just repeat. Prejudice is learned, and children pick it up from the world around them. And one of the very wonderful things that literature can do, I think, is address those stereotypes and show children an alternate world in which those things aren't true. We see it a lot with, for example, the portrayal of girls in fiction. and the portrayal of boys, you know, that girls aren't active, that they have kind of docile roles, and that boys are uncaring and not emotionally engaged. And through fiction, we can show that those are stereotypes that aren't true, because we all know those children who aren't like that. But we don't need to repeat the stereotypes. We can absolutely set up examples for of children who are very different to those. So how do you make a voice powerful? Did I answer this? I can't remember. I think you make it powerful by making it your own and making it unique. If I think of books that have really gripped me, they're books that I know that only that author could have written. So there's a book called Love That Dog by Sharon Creech, and it's a poem. And it's a poem about a child who goes to school, whose teacher's trying to get him to like poetry, and he keeps complaining bitterly about how he doesn't like poetry. But as the whole thing is written in free verse, we start to find out all sorts of things about him, and about that he does actually quite like poetry, and about what happened to his dog. And it is just it's such a perfect book. It's incredibly short. It's a huge surprise. It's not like any other book we can read. There's a novel like Holes, which, and I know that if anybody talks to me for more than about an hour, they're going to hear about my passion for Holes. It's a book about a child who's sent to a juvenile detention center in Texas for apparently stealing a pair of trainers, which he didn't steal. And when he gets there, a great plot emerges of the warden of the detention center looking for buried treasure, and all the boys in the detention center being roped into digging holes all over this desert in Texas. And it's extraordinary. It's just such an audacious book. It has two main narratives. It has the story of Stanley Yelnats and his false imprisonment, and it has a parallel story set in the deep past. And it's about how the two come together. And it's really a wonderful book to read if you want to look at the way in which an author masterfully handles the author voice, the voice of the main character, the voice of his main friend, the voice of the historical characters. And it's wonderful. It's really very, very powerful book. And it's all to do with the author's voice. And I think you make your voice powerful, as I said, by being yourself and read as much as you can, and listen to as many other people's voices as you can, to get a sense of how to change things and shake things up. So somebody said, I usually hear that sometimes my voice is overwhelming my story. How do I improve it to make the story better? Also, do the points raised on the voice only pertain only to novels? Because I write poetry a lot, and I want to know if it also applies. Yes, it also applies, definitely. If you think of how many different poets there are in the world and how different their poems sound, that's voice. So there's William Carlos Williams, or there's Benjamin Zephaniah, or there's Lem Sissay, or there's Emily Dickinson. And each of those poets sounds completely different to the other poets, and that's voice. If your voice is overwhelming your story, is it a case of, I said at the beginning when I was thinking of things that we can do that can be a little bit overwhelming, are your sentences very, very long? Do you use a lot of description in what you write? Do you use a lot of metaphor and imagery? Do your stories go off on eddies of description and sub-story to come back to the main story? And that's all wonderful, but it can be hard to follow a plot or a story if that's going on. You have to be quite critical of your own writing, which can be really hard, or you have to find people that you trust, whose advice you trust, and listen to what they have to say about what you're writing. Okay, so we're at 11 o'clock now, and Debbie, I don't know if you can hear me. Do you have anything you would like to contribute at this point? Because what I think I shall do, bearing in mind that we're here for 2 hours, is move on to character and talk about character a bit, character building, and what that means.
Yeah, go for it, Sarah.
Okay. So, character. How do we create plausible characters? How do we think about creating people that are real to the reader, not one-dimensional, not stereotypes, not cliches? And the best fiction, I think, is fiction in which we relate to the characters, we see their humanity, and we have a sense of them as real and plausible people. Because the reading fiction is being submerged in a real world, albeit on paper that we're, or online, however we're reading. But we have to believe in that place. We have to, when we're reading that book, if we think, oh, that's ridiculous, that would never happen, and why is this person speaking like this, and why is this, this isn't logical, we're not going to be fully engaged with the story. And character is really one of the most important ways, I think, of gripping readers. Some people say that they're engaged by plot, and that the plot makes them care about the characters. And other people say that they're engaged by characters, and it's by caring about the characters that they want to know what happens next in the book. But either way, the character is hugely important in bonding your reader to what you've written. You want to form a relationship and live vicariously through that personality that's on the page. And the best way to do that is to create an engaged, fully realized, complicated protagonist. And without a great character, we really don't care about plot. We're not breathless about the stakes. We kind of lack the motivation to keep turning the pages. And of course, there's very few novels where there's only one character. I mean, they do exist, but they don't generally exist in the children's book world. But generally in the children's book world, we have a host of characters in each book. And it's what happens between those characters, the interplay between those characters, which is the story. The best characters are those that the reader loves or loves to hate. They inspire passion, and that starts with the writer's passion for the protagonists. In order for the reader to care, you have to care first. And that emotion, empathy, and understanding is what will give life to your fictional people. So, goodies and baddies. We have to create plausible characters. Not everyone is all good or all bad. We need to write nuanced characters. We need to think about our heroes as people who are flawed, and our baddies as people who aren't. Not everybody will think they're bad. Their mothers we hope, will love them. They'll have a best friend who thinks that they're heroic. They'll have people who don't see all their negative characteristics. Their negative behavior may be shown only to a few people and to the reader. So use that play to help create rounded characters. We need to know them warts and all. And we also need to see the supporting characters like that too. They need to have their own lives, their own motivations, their own behavior, and that needs to support the main character in the main quest and plot drive of the novel. As I said earlier on, avoid stereotypes and avoid cliches. So when you're thinking about your character, think about not only what they look like, avoid things like thinking about them in terms of hair color, eye color, height, weight, relatively superficial things, in fact. But think about the deeper things about them. Think about where they were born, what their parents are like, what their fears are, what their dreams and aspirations are, what their anxieties are. And the more that you dive into the full depth of your character, the realer they will be for the reader. Because while you don't necessarily put all of that into the book, it's all in your head when you're writing, and that is it's a sort of invisible ink in the book, and the reader does sense that and feel that. It's a very important thing that flows through a book. I know lots of people know that Jo Rowling, when she was writing the Harry Potter books, had a backstory for every character in the book, in the series. There's hundreds and hundreds of characters, but at any point she could be asked, what's Neville Longbottom's heritage? And she would be able to tell you. She'd be able to tell you anything about any of her characters, but none of that is, or very little of that, relatively speaking, is actually in the books. So if she can do it, we can all do it. So I think there are 6 things we need to know about character early on in the course of a story. What is your character's worldview? How do they think about life? And what is their overall attitude about it? Are they optimistic, pessimistic, foolhardy? Do they see everything in quite a light-hearted way, or are they terribly serious? What's their overall, overarching philosophical and emotional view of the world? Quite early on, we need at least one piece of context and a detail about how they relate to and interact with the world. We need to see that worldview in practice. We need to see, for example, if it's somebody's birthday, and what's their reaction to their presents? How do they, if it's their sibling's birthday, what's their reaction to their sibling's excitement about their birthday? That will start to give us a sense of their character. We need at least one objective or goal, either big picture or pertaining to the scene at hand. So again, when we see how somebody's trying to achieve something, the action that they will take in order to achieve it, we get a good sense of their character. We need at least one piece of voice that gives us a hint of their language and energy and the way that they notice things around them. So back to voice. How does voice work in helping us get a sense of this character? How do we see them interacting? And we need at least one concrete choice or action, what's known as a save the cat moment, a heroic moment that endears the character to the reader. And it shows the reader that this is someone that we can root for, that someone we can care for, that someone who makes kind choices, someone who is decent at heart, assuming of course that the character that we're talking about is the hero, the goodie. If you're thinking about writing the baddie, the protagonist, the antagonist, you would want to see that they were duplicitous or not trustworthy through something that they've done in their action. We do definitely need to have dynamic characters. If the character is all one thing or all another, they can be really hard to bond with. And it's important to think about how to create plausible characters that will hold the reader, and not tokenistically. It's very important to see it as a natural and integrated part of their character. So when you're describing your characters, don't use generic terms to describe them. So don't say, Jill was a medium-sized girl with brown hair and brown eyes. Joe was a tall boy. Concentrate on characteristics that are specific to your character. So Jill tested the way she was never picked for netball team. Joe was secretly proud of the fact that teachers always asked him to collect the homework. I mean, we get an idea pretty quickly of both those characters by giving us something specific about them. And think about yourself. And when you look in the mirror, what you don't notice is the color of your hair, or your eyes, or the pattern of your shirt. You notice a hair out of place. You notice freckles or a mole, bit of smudged makeup. And so just try to describe what is unique and irregular, rather than being tall or short, or those kinds of descriptions are they don't give us much of a sense of the character of the person. But to be told that somebody comes to school every day with their shoelaces undone gives us a sense of their character. Either they're careless, or they're in too much of a hurry that they can't be bothered to tie up their shoelaces, or they always want to be able to kick their shoes off under their desk really quickly when they sit down. So we can also think about using the plot and using elements of the plot to explore character. So we can use conflict to explore character. Internal conflict, for example. Internal conflict pits a character against their own mind or heart, which is why this type of conflict is also called character versus self. For this type of character to play out, a character must be pulled in 2 or more directions while attempting to make an important decision. Common pulls or triggers include desire. Simply put, a character wants something. Need. A character requires something for physical, emotional, spiritual, or mental survival. Duty. Obligation leads a character to do what they feel is right or necessary, regardless of whether they desire to take action. Fear. The assumed consequences of a circumstance or decision pressure a character to act or remain inactive. And expectation. A character feels obliged to do as others wish, often for sheer social self-preservation. When a character experiences 2 or more of these triggers at a time, internal conflict is born. The character knows they must make a decision on what actions or non-actions they will take, but the triggers they experience make the decision difficult. During this time, your character may experience doubt, confusion, mental or emotional distress, anxiety, or fear. So here I'm going to give you some examples of internal conflict as found in popular novels. In The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, Katniss Everdeen volunteers to compete in a government-mandated fight-to-the-death style arena game in order to protect her sister. Katniss doesn't want to kill her fellow competitors, but with a family that relies on her for survival, Katniss is desperate to win. Fear, duty, and need intertwine as Katniss fights to survive the games without sacrificing her soul to the government that oppresses her. In The Lord of the Rings, Aragorn is the long-lost rightful king to the realm of Gondor. Prophecy dictates that he is the man to take the throne, but Aragorn hesitates to fulfill his prophecy, fearing that the same corruption that ran through his ancestors' veins will cause him to turn also to darkness and lead his people astray. Peter Rabbit, something much younger. His conflicts are his desire to go off and play versus the danger of doing so and being caught by Mr. McGregor, or being told off by his mother for not obeying the rules. So we get caught up in the tension of the character's behavior immediately. So how can we use internal conflict successfully? The key to crafting successful internal conflict lies in consequences. In essence, your character should be stuck between a rock and a hard place. No matter which decision they make, negative consequences should ensue, or at least your character should believe they will ensue. Those consequences create tension. Questions like, what will the character choose to do? What will they really face those consequences? How the heck are they going to get out of this situation? Will they risk all just for this? And by seeing how they make all of these choices, we get a real sense of what they are like as people. When you think about your character, a really good exercise to do is to write a profile of them. Think about how you want them to think about what they're like, who they are, what their standing is in the group, what their likes are. Think about everything from their favorite food to their the games that they like, books that they like to read, and think about their friends and the group in which they exist in the same way, and write bios of each of them. Get to know them incredibly well. Really dive into their being, so that way your readers will be as conversant with them as you are. Let's see. I wanted to read this little piece of writing as well to you. A lot of children's literature is anthropomorphic. So we see stories through animal characters who carry human characteristics, and the stories are told through them. And I think this book, the opening pages give us a really clear sense of this guinea pig's character. From the very beginning, there was not the slightest doubt that Olga Topolga was the sort of guinea pig who would go places. There was a kind of charm about her, something in the set of her whiskers, an extra devil-may-care twirl to the rosettes in her brown and white fur, and a gleam in her eyes which set her apart. Even her name had an air of romance. How she had come by it was something of a mystery, and Olga herself told so many fanciful tales about moonlit nights, castles in the air, and fields awash with oats and beautiful princesses, each tale wilder than the one before, that none of the other guinea pigs in the pet shop knew what to believe. So reading that, I think we get a real sense of the character that Michael Bond wants us to read about over the next 200 pages. She potentially makes up stories, it's suggested. She's definitely quite courageous and cheeky with the way that she does it. And we've got to be engaged enough with her to want to find out what's the truth and what's not, what's bravado and what's real about her story. So characters. If we think about character-driven novels, as I said, they're books in which we are engaged with the humanity in the story. In Aisha's novel, The Deep Blue Between, there's two characters, they're twin sisters, and Aisha's done a very lovely thing in the book where she alternates chapters from the point of view of one sister to the point of view of the other. So we have two narratives and two sisters, twin sisters, who are actually really different, who engage with the world in quite different ways, who embrace the challenges of the time, one with more trepidation than the other. And there's a beautiful balance to the story. And that's something that we can think about, I think it's an interesting way of storytelling, is to have parallel stories that relate to one another to tell the overall story. We talked a little bit about point of view at the beginning, first person versus third person, and the way in which writing in first person does give you a lot of control over how your character is expressed to the reader. But sometimes I fear that it also, the writer's slightly too close to the characters when it's first person. And the characters don't have quite the subtlety and range that they do when the writer steps back and is writing in the third person, and almost like a theatre director having various characters doing various things. The lovely thing about third person is that it allows your characters to balance one another in a quite an effective way. And it is, as I say, a little bit more like a theatre production. So let me, I'm sorry, I'm just going to look for my notes. What I said. I wonder if anybody would like to ask any questions about character. I'm feeling like I need a bit of inspiration to carry on talking. I'm not repeating myself. Let's see. Somebody's asked, what's the title of the book about the dog and poetry? It's called Love That Dog, and it's by Sharon Creech. I'm not sure if I'm seeing any new questions, and if I'm assuming that people can still hear me. Can you still hear me, Debbie? Somebody's asking if I can talk a little bit more about tenses.
Can hear you, Sarah. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Past tense, present tense, and future tense, if that's what you mean. I suppose I tend not to notice it because it should be seamless. Whichever tense you choose to write in, you should be incredibly consistent and not flip out of it. If you do, you have to rely on your editors to spot that that's happened. I'm thinking that really it's only past tense and future tense, past tense and present tense, but future tense I can't quite imagine working, but that would be very brave to give it a try. But consistency, always it's about consistency and not unless it's deliberate, unless it's part of the story, not accidentally moving from one to the other. Because one of the things I think one notices a lot when reading first, second, third drafts of a novel is that an author's tendency to want to retell what's happened in the book. And we'll talk about that a little bit further down the line, but it's sort of retelling the story that you've already told. Readers are incredibly attuned to what you're saying in your novel. And as readers, we tend to remember everything. Everything sort of gets stamped into our minds. So you don't need to tell us again. And so we do notice things like change of tense. Shut the door so that the annoying dogs barking downstairs don't disturb us too much. And again, with, coming back to character, if characters behave inconsistently, readers do notice. If you're saying your character is brave and noble and always does the right thing, and then shirks away from resolving a playground issue in which a younger child is being bullied, well, they're not really those things. They don't have the courage that you've suggested that they do. Now, you might be wanting to do that deliberately in a way to show us that this character wants to present themselves as those great and noble things, but in actual fact, that character doesn't have that stamina, or you might have done it by accident. So those are the kinds of things to be mindful of in terms of consistency with character, I think. Somebody's asked, would a character for a 7 to 10-year-old be less complex? I don't think so. I think what a character for the 7 to 10-year-old in the 7 to 10-year-old book would be less worldly and less experienced. So a 7 to 10-year-old child will have a whole range of emotional concerns, but they will be within the range of experience that child can have. A child who is living in a place where it's going to work, age 7, is going to have very different experience to a child who living in a place that is living in a wonderful apartment with a beachside view and getting driven to a private school. Those two children are going to have very different perspectives on the world, drawing on their experience. I think the fundamental difference between adult books and children's books is not to do with style, it's not to do with complexity, it's not to do with sophistication, and it's not to do with quality. It's to do with the range of experience that you can legitimately explore in a children's book because of a child's experience of the world. A book for children can be centered on the theme of divorce and the way that that divorce impacts on the child. An adult book can be about divorce, and of course it's going to be very different because it's going to be about the adults and the stresses and strains on their relationships. Both books dealing with a difficult theme, but looking at it one from the left and one from the right. That's so no, I really believe that the characters in children's books and the writing in children's books is as complex, as sophisticated, and as challenging as they are in adult books, or even middle grade to teen to YA. But they just have to reflect what that age group of child would have as his experience.
We have some really good questions, Sarah, in the Q&A. Mm-hmm.
So you have, somebody has a mother and son, mother, son, and dragon in their book. Oh, that sounds fantastic. And what framing questions could they use to build character profiles for each of them? Well, I'm assuming, and I'm very much hoping, that the dragon is an active participant in this book and that they have a character and they have a role to play and they're going to help drive the narrative. I seem to have some quite handy books here that I can show you. This is a book I'm reading at the moment, The Boy Who Dreamed of Dragons. And there's lots of dragons in this, and they all have very different characters. And there's a really sarcastic dragon, and there's a really brave dragon, and there's a dragon who really just wants to stay at home and eat. And so there's lots of different characteristics of those dragons. I think if you have animal, mythical, or made up characters in your book that aren't human, you should treat them as if they were human. And while you may describe them differently in that the scales on one dragon's back are so much harder and hornier than on another dragon's back, which is still sort of new and soft, you would think of them in terms of their characteristics, their kind of motivation, their internal being, as if they are people, because you're going to want your readers to feel about them in the same way. Olga Topolga, the wily guinea pig, she's just like a little person, but happens to be a guinea pig. If we think of something like Watership Down, all those rabbits, but people read them as if they're a social group of human beings. So you have to treat your dragons or your animals or your mythical beings or your gods in absolutely the same way as you would treat any of the characters that you're writing about. Let's see. In the case where you're writing a fable where your main character teaches a lesson, is it fine to make the character unidimensional, or there still has to be some nuances? I think they need nuance, personally, because it will make the fable so much more engaging if we're reading about a character who we feel engaged with, if we feel that we could be that character. I suppose that's it. Successful characters are characters that we relate to, that we can imagine ourselves in their situation. We can imagine ourselves having to make the same choices as them. And we can only do that by you, the author, creating very plausible characters. If you want to write a fable that you're informing your readers of some truths in life, it can either come over in a bit of a sort of dry biscuit form as a lesson, or it can come over as a wonderful journey that we are enriched by. I think if you think of writers like Neil Gaiman, who uses fable a lot in his writing, I think he's a wonderful example of a writer whose work shows you how rich and complex and sophisticated fables can be in a contemporary setting, without them being too didactic and educational. And I think that readers, young readers, older readers like myself, tend to find it easier to take the medicine when it tastes really sweet and it's told in a really beautiful way. Right, there we go. When looking at supernatural characters, how do you approach balancing their non-human versus making them non-human nature versus making them well-rounded? I think you have to make their non-human nature relatable to humans. You have to make their non-human nature relatable to the reader. Back to this thing of how do we, why do we care about the character? So this supernatural character, I mean, obviously, thank you so much for the great question. Because I haven't read your work, I can't be specific at all. I'm sorry about that. But if I think about Marvel comics and superheroes in that context, you know, why do we care about Batman? Why do we care about him more than we care about the Joker? I mean, we care about the Joker a lot, but we don't particularly like the Joker. If we're thinking about gods and goddesses in books, and the way in which the narrative could circle around their superpower, their kind of abilities. If they're not involved in the same kind of conflicts we were talking about earlier on, there's sort of internal conflicts and external conflicts of things threatening their aspirations and their dreams, we're not going to engage with them in the same way that we would characters who you had set up in that way. I think even when writing supernatural characters or very fantastical characters set in deep fantasy worlds, you have to do it in a way that they remain relatable to us sitting at our tables, lying on our beds, wherever we are based in the world. If they don't have the same emotional depth and range as us, we're possibly going to find it a little bit harder to really engage with them. What makes children's books more appealing to adults than others? I wonder what makes some children's books more appealing to adults than others. I think it's possibly the same thing that makes those children's books more appealing to children than others, and that's good writing, very good world building, believable characters, strong voice, and actually it's pretty much the same things for all of us as readers. I think once you're literate, once you're reading a book, for all the depth and nuance that a fully literate person is reading a book for, as a child or as an adult, you're looking for the same things. And I think, like everything, some people prefer apples and some people prefer pairs. Some people prefer humor and some people prefer suspense. I think it's a real shame that adults grow out of reading children's books, because actually children's literature is just so amazing. It's absolutely wonderful. It's very direct. One of the definitions I've read in the past about what makes the difference between an adult book and a book for young readers is the ending, is that generally in a book for young readers, the book ends with hope. Often in books for adults, books end without that hope. They can end on much more pessimistic note. Generally, I literally can think of about one book for young readers that ends without leaving the reader with hope in their hearts. And I suppose that's one of the things that I love about books for young readers, is that there's a sense that life can be changed for the good, and that things work out okay, and that positivity will win out. And I think for an awful lot of adults, there's a great joy to be had from reading those books too, for those adults that still read books for young readers. Sorry, I'm just looking back through to see if I can find some more questions. We have about half an hour left. Somebody has asked, which I think it might be interesting to explore a little bit, to help writers' expectations, can you speak about the editorial process and how long it takes to edit a typical children's book in the different categories? I know who the person is that's asked the question, so thank you very much. It's hello. How long is a typical editorial process? Honestly, how long is a piece of string? I've worked on books for 2 years and done 8 or 9 rounds of reading, editing, reading, suggestions, author rewriting, back it comes, and so on and so forth. Literally 8 or 9. I have received a novel which is in such impeccable state that I've had tiny little suggestions along the lines of, I think we need a full stop here, or it would be great to know a little bit more about what happened around one specific element of the plot. And that's taken 2 weeks for the author to go away and think about. I think it's in terms of writers' expectations, is, as I said earlier on, be prepared to work, expect to work, expect to be writing and rewriting, editing and thinking and processing what you've done innumerable times before it gets to the point where you're absolutely confident that you've created the best book that you can. A story that I tell all the time is about the author Lewis Sacca, who wrote Holes. If anybody wants suggestion for something to read between now and next weekend, read Holes by Lewis Sacca. It's an absolute masterpiece. When Lewis wrote the first draft, he typed it all up on his computer and he pressed delete, and then he started again. And then he didn't use that second draft to edit. He started a fresh draft, a third draft, and he edited into that. When he's asked why he deletes the first draft, he says it's literally the draft he writes in order to clarify his thoughts, in order to think about how the characters relate to each other, the main plot points, the tent poles in the plot that will drive the story forward. And he doesn't, if he starts trying to edit into that first draft, what he ends up doing is trying to save things, and he doesn't need to save anything because it's all about what's in his head. And it's the next draft, or even the draft after that, that is the one that he will edit into in order to end up with a final book. And I think as writers, there's great courage in writing a story. It's huge courage. It's a really hard thing to do. to think about the characters, the voice, the setting, the plot, what it is you want to say, how you want to say it, who do you want to say it to. And part of that courage is knowing that sometimes if something isn't working, or if you need to radically change something, you can do that. You literally can do that. I've edited books where I've said to authors, we don't need these 3 characters. They're not really helping drive the story. You can just take out that whole bit of the story, and what you're left with is something that's much purer and stronger and has much more power. Or I've said to writers, this is a wonderful piece of writing, but the story just sort of wanders around. Why don't we just take this one little bit and develop this bit of the story, and think about how to develop this bit of plot and follow this one character, because this is the character who's really engaging. And even though in the first draft, the author thought of that character as a sort of complementary character rather than the main person in the book. So editing really is how long is a piece of string, and also how hard are you prepared to work, because it's really hard work, and it has to be done in around all the other things we have to do: working, getting to work, looking after children, all the many things we have to do. There's very few people who are able to write full-time without any kind of concerns about having to earn a living. Somebody's asked Lewis who. It's Lewis Sachar, C-S-A-C-H-A-R, Sachar, Lewis Sachar. He's written a lot of books, but Holes that's the corker for me. Does every children's book have to have a happy ending? Well, not necessarily, but I personally think it's helpful. I like to leave a reader feeling uplifted at the end of a book, rather than either frustrated or anxious and depressed. There's a lot of things to worry about in the world, and children worry a lot. And even when we're dealing with difficult issues like, and somebody else has asked about this, death, suicide, immigration, homelessness, poverty, I think in a children's book we can handle it in a way that there's a point of hope at the end, that not everybody is left in despair. Debbie, can you see any other questions that I might have missed about voice or character? And if not, I might suggest some writing exercises and talk a little bit about next week and how we'd like to carry on.
There's a new one that just came. 2 new questions just came through. And if there are any more questions, I think now would be the time to put them in, guys. One from Patrick and one from Ayo.
Okay, great. I've read about writers who edit their work as they go along, while others do not edit until the draft is complete. What are the advantages and disadvantages? I personally would say do not edit your work as you go along, because you're not going to finish it. You're going to endlessly find that page needs rethinking about. But how can you know what that page needs to be like until you've got the whole thing and it's within a context? And I'm quite ruthless about that when I'm working with writers, is I absolutely beg people not to edit as they go along, that they write the draft and then have a think about what you want to do. And I think a lot of times people worry that they're going to forget, that you're going to forget. Well, you're not going to forget the important things, and you're not going to, if you forget one thing, you'll think of something else that's better. And what is the place of identity when writing for children? I'm not sure if you mean the author's identity or the character's identity, but either identity is core, isn't it? Surely our identity and the identity of our characters is what makes those books special. For one thing, your identity as the writer is what makes, gives you the point of view to write the story that you're writing. My identity, if I were a writer, would provide me with a point of view that would inform the story that I wanted to write. And then within each book, within the world, the fictional world that you're creating, the character's identity is really, really important. And whether that's a social and political thing or a personal idea of oneself personally, which is also, of course, social and political, it's kind of crucial. I do kind of like books that aren't blunt objects, though. And I think the most subtle books often carry the heaviest punch in terms of exploring issues of identity. Somebody had asked earlier on, we talked a little bit about the use of names and the way that names can be informed with the social understanding, and how you can use a character, you can create a character that people will have a certain perception of at the beginning of the book, and show at the end of the book how that character's standing is so very different to the stereotype. And hopefully we can upset people's ideas of and notions of what we are like based on their assumption of our identity. Okay, so a couple of writing exercises. I'm going to try and share the screen again, because I think that's going to be the best way of showing these writing exercises. So let me see. I think it's going to happen. Right, here we are. So let me, oh, I'm going to find it hard now to, right, there we go. So voice, write a scene from two different perspectives. School friends have had an argument. One of the friends is the quieter and the other a louder, braver character. How do they both view the argument? What do they both feel? How do they think about what has happened? So write the scene from the perspective of friend A and then from the perspective of friend B. Think about, they both have to have both been involved in the same argument. They've argued with one another. How do they see it? Describe a walk on the beach first on a perfect sunny day when the character has just received great exam results. And now describe the same walk when the character has received very poor exam results. Try to think about the way in which the scene reflects the mood of the characters. So this is an exercise in voice. The character, first character is elated, happy, couldn't be happier. The second character is feeling absolutely desperate. They're worried about their parents' reaction. They're worried about getting through to the next year. They're worried about their bursary. What are all the things they could be worried about? But don't just tell us what they're worried about. Think about how the world around them mirrors their emotional response to what's happened to them in the day. And in the first one, think about an argument. I mean, how do you feel when you've had an argument? Do you feel the other person is absolutely unjustified in their response? Do you feel you're worried that you've hurt their feelings by saying something that you wish you could take back, but words are like eggs and once broken, they can't be retrieved? Think about the whole range of ways in which you yourself react in an argument, and try and channel that into the voice of these two young people. So that's voice. And let me see if I can get the next one. Character. Create a character profile for each of your main characters, not just what they look like, but what they like. Do they like going to have their nails done? Do they like running? Do they like bird watching? Do they like staying at home with their mother? Do they like getting away as far away from home as they can? Think about all of their likes and dislikes. Who are they? Do they always tell the truth? Do they keep secrets? Are they shy? Are they extrovert? Are they disruptive? Do they deliberately cause trouble at school in order to try to divert attention away from the fact that they haven't done their homework? Who are they? And put your character in different settings and see how they react. Imagine them in a standoff with an unfair teacher, for example. Imagine them in a situation with a friend when the friend is accused of something. Play with the outcomes. Think of different characters in those settings as well. So if you are working on a novel in which there's a group of 4 friends, or a mother, a son, and a dragon, put each of those characters in these different settings and see how they react. And think of some settings for yourself. Think of different scenarios that they could be involved in, and just write it. Don't hesitate, don't edit, don't think about writing great literature. Just write it so that you can really live the character and live their behavior and live their emotional range. If you think about, if I think about books like Holes or Harry Potter, there's 4 or 5 main characters at any one point that we care about. So I'm hope that everybody's working on books that involve more than just the central protagonist. Put all your different characters in these different settings and see how they react. Right, I think that's it. Let's see if there's any more questions. Sorry, you've heard me rabbiting on for 2 hours. I'm hoping some of it's made sense. If there's anything that anybody wants to know about specifically, please do say. How many words per exercise? How many do you want to do? Absolutely up to you. How much time do you have? Sometimes it's quite good to limit yourself and say, I'm going to write 100 words per exercise. Sometimes you can get carried away and write much more. Sometimes you only want to write 20. Back to what we were saying about voice, think about how you use the words in the voice exercises to make your voice sound different. So you might want to talk for 150, 200 words, or you might want to say it in 10. You might want to be really concise and really frustrated about the exam results, and it might need to just come out in 2 or 3 very short sentences. Try lots of different things, practice lots of different things, and be really courageous. Try it in rhyme, try it in free verse, try it in 4-word sentences or 5-word sentences like that piece I read out, and then try varying it. Play, just play. It's the best way of really getting a sense of how your writing can change, improve, polish. Just be very, very playful, and remember that there's nothing, you can't do anything wrong. None of it is unhelpful. It's all really useful, good stuff to be doing. So just while you're sitting, if you're sitting watching the television, or if you have some time in the garden, or if you're on the bus going somewhere, just sketch it out. And I noticed somebody had asked at some point, is it good to write out longhand or to type out a story? Again, whatever suits you. Sometimes it's really helpful to write little pieces longhand because it's a sort of slightly slower process. And so you get to think about the words in a different way. But it's what suits you, absolutely what suits you. Is it okay to edit your own book? Yes, it is. And often it's the only person that is going to be able to edit it for some time. But as I said earlier on, please try not to edit while you're writing, because often what happens is that you just keep, it's sort of like knitting a few lines and then unknitting and then knitting and then unraveling and then knitting. And is it one step forward and two steps back, or is it two steps forward and one step back? Either one isn't great. The best thing to do is to get a version down and then to start to edit. But I was talking to an author once who used to be a book editor in the children's book world, and she's written some really, truly fabulous books for children. And she said the thing that she does, which she feels is very important to her, is when she's finished that first draft, she puts it in the proverbial drawer and goes away for 6 weeks and doesn't read it or think about it for 6, well, she probably thinks about it a lot, but she doesn't read it for 6 weeks. Then she comes back and reads it. And that way she feels that she has some perspective on her own writing, because it's very, very hard to read your own writing. It's very, 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 very hard. And so you need distance. And if you press full stop, the end, and then immediately start reading from the beginning again, you're not going to have the distance that's required to make sense of it. So do give yourself a break between finishing and starting reading again. How are we submitting the exercises? Well, the exercises are really for you. They're for you to get a sense of the range and experimentation that it's all right to do as a writer. Not only is it all right to do, it's pretty essential to do, I think, is to experiment and play. What Debbie and I will do is that we'll put together an email with the writing exercises and perhaps a few more. And I'd encourage you very, very strongly to search the internet, to read writing guides and find other writing exercises and set yourself other writing exercise tasks, because it's super helpful. We had, when Debbie and I were working on the plan for this workshop, we had thought originally that we might have 15 or 20 people, and that we'd be able to be much more, oh goodness, I'm running out of words, 2 hours of going on, interactive.
Interactive, yeah.
Thank you, that's the word. But we unfortunately, fortunately, we've got so many people taking part that we're not going to be able to offer that. What we are going to say, though, at the end of our 3-week session is that we would love to hear from people about their work specifically. So we're going to ask you in 3 weeks' time, we're going to give you detail of how to get in touch with us and to send us your writing so that we can have a look at it for a chord and hopefully be able to offer advice to some people. Debbie, is there anything else? You've gone very silent.
Sorry. Yeah, I think that's a question that has been here for a while. Could you please recap answers on how to introduce new words to young readers without making it difficult?
New words? Just the same way, I suppose, that you would speak to a child anyway. I mean, I don't know how you are with children. I profoundly believe that you don't talk down to children, and that you don't assume that their understanding of things is less sophisticated, and that their ability to work out stuff isn't really brilliant. And so I would tend to use any of the words that you want. And obviously quantum physics might, well, I mean, that would throw me, but it might throw your average 7-year-old. But the normal range of conversation that you would use in life, you can use in a book. And if a child doesn't know the meaning of a word and they're a good reader, they're going to go and find out what it is. And sometimes they can work out what it is through the sentence. And that's the purpose of reading, is that you learn, and you learn new words, and you learn new philosophies, and you learn, you embrace new ideas, and you do it sort of seamlessly through the process of the story. So don't worry about introducing anything really, if as long as it fits in the story and it's comfortable there, you can have it. Bearing in mind, of course, that what you would have in a picture book for a 4-year-old is going to be quite different to what you're going to have in a full-length fantasy novel for a 14-year-old.
So I think we have 2 or 3 more questions, and then we can probably round up. Is it okay to edit your own book?
I've spoken to that one.
Okay. Is it possible to share our exercises with each other for feedback?
Well, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, we'll have to figure
that out.
We'll figure that out. Okay.
That would be
That's
so
the
nice.
final one, yeah. Not sure if you've already answered this, but I'm doing my master's and working full time and still want to make time to write. I guess if you can share anything on finding balance, I'd appreciate that. I don't want to wait until I have a month off or I'm not working, but I want it to be a daily or weekly habit.
I don't know if you know the adult author Jodi Picoult. She's very popular. When she started writing, she was a debut author and nobody knew her. And before she was published, she had to find time with her 3 children as a single parent with a full-time job to write her books. So she got up at 4:30 every morning and she wrote for 2 to 3 hours before she got her kids up for school. She took herself off to work. She went to work in the bank or in the insurance company or whatever she was doing. She came home, she did the washing and the shopping and the feeding and the cooking, and she went to bed and she went to sleep, and she got up at 4:30 in the morning. And she did that for really quite a long time. She was so committed to her writing, and she was so committed to making it work for her, that is what she did. I'm afraid that there's no magic wand to making things easier for anybody. It really is a case of getting up at the crack of dawn or pre-dawn and doing your hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, however many hours you need to do each day to get that book written. And you have to have such faith in yourself and such belief in yourself and such confidence that what you're doing is something that the world is going to want to share with you, that you're going to get up and do it. And it's tough. It's hard work.
And I think one thing you've said a lot, Sarah, is that, great books are a result of a great deal of hard work. And I feel like when you go in with that mindset, you almost prepare yourself for the work ahead. I think when we have the expectation that, it can like almost just happen, that's when, we don't make the commitment beforehand. So, yeah.
There's those sort of famous stories of people's first novels selling for lots of money and going straight on the bestseller list. The author was writing that book for 5 or 6 years before it got published.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen overnight. It really doesn't. It takes such a long time. It's a labor of love. But it is also, people are compelled, I think, to write if they're going to write. And you just have to wrestle the time out. And yes, you don't, if you got a month's holiday, it's not going to happen very often, but every day happens, every day. Every day we get the opportunity to try and carve out an hour or an hour and a half somewhere. Great. Well, next week, we're going to talk about setting and research and dialogue. I think in a way we've probably dealt with 2 really tricky issues today, because they're quite kind of, voice is particularly hard to get a grasp of, but and character is such a personal thing. Setting and research are fun, and dialogue is none of it's easy. Sorry, I can't. I'm not going to be able to promise that for anybody, but I look forward to talking to everybody next week. And thank you so much for your time this morning. I'm really grateful that we got to share it with you. And I'm just very sorry that there's so many people that we can't get to see everybody's face, which would be really nice. Debbie, anything?
Yeah, so I'm gonna try and figure out if we're able to just email this group specifically. But regardless, I think you should be able to expect to hear from us in the week with the exercises. And I think someone had asked if we could share the book list, the recommendations. So we'll do our best to share that.
I will do a book list as we go along, but I'm kind of suspecting that what I might do is do a book list right at the end.
Okay. Okay.
Particularly for books like the Ursula Le Guin, Steering the Craft, those kind of craft books about the process of writing. Because I hope that during the course of the 3 weeks, I'll mention different things.
So we look forward to seeing everybody same time, bright and early next week, Saturday.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Take care. Have fun in the week, doing your writing and doing your things.
Yes.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.